The boys were very excited to go sledding.
Sledding. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the primary joys of childhood.
That's
All
great.
right. Well, here we are. We're live. Paul and I were just talking about the weather. Finally got a little snow here in New England and got to take my boys sledding. They went actually Sunday afternoon and Monday afternoon. I think tonight it's all going to get rained on and be gone. So I was glad they got out there to enjoy the weather, enjoy childhood. And as we start this brand new year, 2024, we're back in our New Jerusalem discussion. And in some ways, our theme this week is related to childhood. We're talking about baptism, which for many Christians is something that happens when we're infants, when we're babies. Um,
Hmm.
Certainly, in some traditions, baptism doesn't happen till later on when we choose it for ourselves. But yeah, it's a sacrament in the church where we are washed clean. And so perhaps a nice way to start the new year. It's a new year ahead. We start fresh. And I've got Paul Deming with me this morning to discuss the subject from St. Louis. You want to say hey, Paul?
Hey, Paul.
Hey, Paul. There he is. It's a kind of a short chapter, so we can get into baptism from a lot of different directions. We've been talking in the book so far about a lot of very deep topics about our inner life, our spiritual journey, and this is really the first time we're starting to edge into where that journey meets the practices of the church and the rituals of the church, which I think is interesting. So it might be useful for us to discuss a little bit our experience of those actual rituals. And what meaning they have held for us personally, what meaning they've held throughout the generations, and maybe in particular, what meaning we see them continuing to hold moving forward in the descent of the new church, the emergence of this new church we are a part of. So, where might you like to jump in, Paul, in that conversation?
So this is interesting. I've opened the Bible that I've had since 1972,
Mhm.
and in the inside flap, I've kept the baptism that I was baptized in.
Wow.
This is from September. Let me see if I can see it on here.
Yeah.
September 23rd, 1956. And that was when my father was the minister of the First Methodist Church of Seneca Falls. So, aside from just proving how old I am, this kind of gave me an idea of what they would give to the parents of children who are baptized. And it's literally a little instruction book on what it means to be consecrated, essentially, as a Christian, and a commitment from the parents to raise a child in a Christian way, et cetera, et cetera. So
Mhm.
obviously, it had more symbolic meaning
Mhm.
than anything else. But I don't know that any of my siblings, and I have two sisters and two brothers, don't know that any of them were baptized or have any, I don't know how it happened that as a fourth child that I was baptized and the others were not. But
Were your
it just,
parents not involved? Were they involved in the church regularly?
my father was a minister for 10 years. And so I assumed that for each of my siblings, he was still in the ministry, possibly left the ministry when my youngest sister was born.
Mhm.
But yeah, for a while, this was back in the 50s when, church boards were like, Lord, you keep them humble, we'll keep them poor. So
Mhm.
we lived on very meager means. Um, but we're on the topic of baptism, and I did not since growing up, I wasn't aware of this, obviously, September of, the year I was born. I was born in January, so my birthday is in a couple of weeks. But my thinking at the time of reviewing this and looking at this is realizing that, you know, it has more significance really to the parents of children than it does to the children.
Mhm.
Then as adults, we have a conscious decision to make whether we want to go through what I consider to be a sacred ritual, kind of like
Mhm.
the sacraments.
Mhm.
Um, and the sacraments have symbolic value, and this has symbolic value.
Mhm.
I've never, as a Swedenborgian pastor, baptized anyone. But before coming to the Swedenborgian Church, I was involved in a few baptisms.
Mhm.
Back in the my fundamentalist days, and it was total immersion baptism. So I actually was in a baptismal tank and, dipped the person and in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, I baptize you into the church or into the Lord Jesus. Um, but at that point, it was symbolic of a spiritual cleansing. So, as well as joining a particular church. So it's an interesting topic that we're on today. But thank you for asking me.
Well, it's helpful to hear your story of baptism because I do think it's useful to think about how does this really play out in life and in practice. I know for myself, I was raised by parents who were not churchgoers. So my baptism was really meaningful to my grandmother, who was the organist at a Methodist church and organized and made it possible for me to be baptized there. And I have pictures of myself in a little frilly white dress, being baptized there. But I don't know that it had much meaning for my parents. And certainly I don't have memories of it myself. And that church actually now is a restaurant. And I visited it again, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe longer, no, 15 years ago, and sat in the middle, in front of the altar where there's a bar, drank a martini. I mean, it was sort of an interesting way to remember my baptism. Um, at the same time, in contrast, my children, they were both baptized in the Episcopal Church where my husband serves, and in my husband's tradition, baptism is a big deal, and you kind of get a candle with your name and when you were baptized, and so it's been the tradition since they were small to remember their baptism on their baptism anniversary. And my son Theo's is actually coming up this week. January 11th was when he was baptized, and so on that day we light their candle. We get a special dessert because that's the only way to make it special when you're 7 and 9. Um, and we talk about what it was to be baptized, the people that came and were there, their godparents. And it's like I'm learning about baptism anew through their eyes, of having that time of remembering. I don't know how much deep meaning, but I think for them it's like a reminder of belonging. It's a reminder of the love that kind of came around them at that time. And it's very precious. It's very sweet. It's 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 made me, I think, in my journey, especially having my experience of baptism, which was sort of didn't feel that deeply meaningful. I was like, what are all these external rituals? Is it really important? Is it really? And I think the truth is, it's kind of as important as we make it. It becomes more meaningful the more attention and care we offer it. And because it's something very meaningful to my husband, something meaningful in the Episcopal Church, it's it it carries meaning, because of that intention. um, yeah, I think that reading this chapter and thinking about ritual and the new church, you know there's just no doubt. I mean, the things we do matter, right? The things we do, the the actions we take. And it's lovely to baptize yeah, ourselves and each other. It's we're following a tradition, and there's something very profound in it. And I think in this chapter, and what to me, what's becoming really important about the symbolism and the correspondence of the ritual is it's saying you were beloved when you were born, and you remain beloved, not because of the things you acquire, but because of your innate being. And somehow I think the ritual of washing is like, he talks about how it signifies regeneration, and that regeneration is like clearing us back to our divine self, our kind of first self, that over time kind of we lose sight of. That's the spiritual journey, as we forget who we are, and then we need to remember again. And I think of the sacrament of baptism as sort of reminding us of the waters that we came in to the world through, and that we need to go through again. We need this invitation to a second birth that comes not through putting things on and acquiring prestige and capability and strength, but through a washing away, through a kind of getting back to our birthday suit. um, that's what I've been thinking a lot about. Especially this chapter comes right after the last chapter we discussed before the new year was the crises of the spirit, which I think speaks to that washing away, that regeneration is a process of facing our repentance, of facing the stuff that has gotten in the way of that kind of primary self. And ideally, baptism reminds us of that process and of the intention of engaging that process. How though, I don't know. It's sort of like it's reminded us just by it happening over the generations.
Well, as adults too, when we're baptized, we in essence renounce
Yeah.
that desire in us to separate ourselves from the commandments of the Lord, or to be drawn to something that would keep us from the love of God.
Mm-hmm.
Not that anything can keep us from the love of God, but you know what I mean. It's that idea that before we can consecrate ourselves, we have to renounce within us the desire to do the wrong thing.
Right. I remember that part of the sacrament when as that is a part of the Episcopal liturgy. It's not so much, and I'll talk a little bit about the Swedenborgian liturgy, but I think you renounce Satan like a couple of times as a part of the service, as if you're doing it as an adult, or parents do it on your behalf. In a Swedenborgian baptism, which I have done quite a few of those, and the way that we understand it in the new church, at least in convention, is that we are baptizing people not into the Swedenborgian church, but into the church universal. So we do a lot of baptisms here at the chapel for people who are maybe not members of the denomination, but they're Christians of different ilks. Maybe they're similar to how I was as a kid, with parents who were kind of different traditions, but they want that ritual. They want to take the time to make this commitment to their child and to God, to raise them in a certain way. And so the liturgy is very much about that kind of open love of God and the reception of the children that Jesus makes, and naming this as a intention to recognize that their children, just as they are going through regeneration, that their children are going to be called to this path. And it's really focused in a lot of ways on inviting the parents and the godparents to kind of recognize that commitment and take it seriously. And I always like to really lift up the way love moves, the way that God is doing this regeneration, and we all participate every time we allow love to move through us. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be through catechism, or I'm going to teach you, specific things about the church, but it occurs in the way that we love the child being baptized, in the way that we care for them and stay in relationship with them.
Let me ask you a question since you brought this up.
Yeah.
I've only been going to conventions maybe for the last 17 years or so, but I've never seen a baptism at convention. And if you've performed baptisms that were, for lack of a better word, non-denominational, um, weren't most baptisms always for a specific church body? Like when someone was being baptized, weren't they being baptized into that particular church?
I think that's typically the practice of a lot of Christian churches. In my experience thus far, it is not a practice of convention. In general, and I think a part of it is it's a nod to the child's freedom. It's like we are baptizing you um, into this universal church, recognizing that God is going to meet you from all directions throughout your life and through these people, and that the child will then have the choice. Um, and I go back and forth a little bit about it because I think there's something beautiful in that. And for church community, and I think seeing this in my children's experience at the Episcopal Church, because they carry that other model that you're speaking to, where they're being baptized into this community. And so in that way, on the other side of the coin is just lovely because it's these people, these humans, and we are welcoming you into our community. And there's something very beautiful about that, about holding them and making a commitment to them. And often in the ceremony, there is kind of everybody says something, kind of welcoming that child into that community. Um,
Yeah, I love that.
Probably from our Swedenborgian lens, we're just naming the largeness of that community. But baptism kind of carries both those meanings, and Swedenborg speaks to that in the chapter. On one level, it is about how we, it's marking someone as a member of the church. It's saying you belong to this church. And one element of a Swedenborgian baptism often is that once you're baptized, because I think he speaks to this maybe in this chapter, once you're baptized, the Christian angels gather around you. That not only do people on earth now see, oh, this is a Christian child, I'm welcoming them, but the angels of heaven and the Christians in heaven gather around and welcome this child in. That there's some kind of a unification that occurs on a spiritual plane and on an earthly plane during a baptism at that moment.
Well, there's two things you said that I really resonate with and I really love.
Mhm.
The idea of freedom of choice and how important that is to our theology and to our church in general. And also the word community, because I think when you do have the choice to be baptized into the community or just to be baptized as a symbolic ritual. And I think when you're baptized into the community, it's um, kind of like an ecclesiastical endorsement of it takes a village. And I just love that. I think that's very warm, and I think it's very inviting and welcoming.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Sort of like I think a lot of sacraments and rituals of the church are like just like everything in life. There's a positive and a beauty, and it works, and sometimes it doesn't work. And when it's working, when there's a community that's really showing up, and a family and a child, and we're celebrating, and it's just like there's nothing like it. It's the best thing in the world. I'll never forget both of my sons' baptisms. The first one was out in Anchorage, and he was a little older, and it was January, as I mentioned, January 11th. My sister and brother-in-law came out for it. My parents flew all the way from New England to Alaska. It was kind of, my mom had met Theo, and my dad, I guess, but it was my first time my sister met him. And we put him in a little suit, and he was really chubby and he wanted to splash the water, and we loved that church. It was a wonderful church. They loved us. They'd seen us get married and get pregnant and have, I mean, it was just pure celebration. And one day we'll be able to bring him back there. And this is the church where we were baptized, and people will have memories. I mean, I think it really is a representation of why we do church, is why we do this, is to have memories and consistency and um, relationships between generations. And, there's nothing like church to manifest that. So for them, it's like it's beautiful. And my younger son was baptized here in Boston at the church where my husband serves. He's 7 now, he's been there his whole growing up. Everybody knows him. He sees that baptismal font. It's beautiful. And there's a lot of people that they don't have that experience. And that was not my experience as a child, having that kind of consistency and meaning. So there's a tension, I think, between holding on to between observing these rituals where they really are living, but then what happens when they aren't really living? Like, do we baptize our children to make grandma happy? I think there's a question in here too for me as we think about the new church as this meeting of so many people, different types. Life is just so different now. I've been thinking a lot about how we might be able to hold baptism in new ways, especially to honor all the different ways we came into this world. Like, is my spiritual life less wholesome because I had this kind of disrupted early childhood experience of church, or can I be just as, I think there's like the rituals can go wrong or not be perfect, but like we all take baths, like we all get caught in the rain. Like, water is available to all of us, and washing is a universal behavior and activity. And in that way, I feel like it's signifying something important about what it is to be human and what it is to be on this journey of life where we are seeking to be where we're being regenerated. And I think it's important to hold that too. So there's not that, and sometimes it can be a little more too formulaic to me, the idea that it has to kind of go it doesn't always go the right way, it doesn't always go in a way that is as beautiful as I'm describing it. It's gone from my boys. And Barb's online and is pointing out that water means truth, which is exactly, in our Swedenborgian theology, there's everything in the natural world corresponds to something spiritual, and water is one of the primary symbols of truth, the cleansing properties of truth that is fluid, moving, indestructible. Water is indestructible. It makes its way, and it is necessary to life. It's part of what we're made of, and it's vital to this kind of process of getting dirty and then getting clean, like, which we all go through in our lives. Yeah. I guess I'm wondering, do you think in the new church baptism is it important? Should it happen when we're children, when we're adults? Both? All of the above? What do you think the role of baptism is, maybe ideally, or how you might like to see it evolve? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do think it's important. I think it's more important to some of us who are older
Yeah.
than it is to some of the younger folks.
Mhm.
And I just say that because Sunday during the sermon, I was mentioning that our sanctuary has been consecrated as a place of worship.
Mhm.
Not to say we can't have musical concerts, because we do. Not to say that we can't rent the facility out for other purposes, because some groups will come and rent the facility. But it has been consecrated. It's been set aside as something that we gather together in person to worship the Lord and to celebrate the truths of God. So baptism is important in the sense that we're consecrating ourselves, and we're consecrating babies, and we're making that symbolic gesture to suggest that in addition to renouncing all of the evils in our life, which isn't to say that we've been purified by any sense, but it is to say that we are publicly proclaiming the goodness of God and that all good and all truth comes from God, and that anything that does not come from God, meaning not good or not true, are things that can separate us from God.
Mhm.
So, in that true sense, the baptism is essential. But most of us, I mean, let me ask you this question: does your church have a baptismal font?
We do. We have our baptismal font is right at the front of the church. When we're not having a baptism, it actually doubles as a candelabra. So we put a piece of glass over it and have candles that people light as they come to worship for their own personal prayers. But yeah, oh yeah, we have a big and mighty baptismal font. I know a lot of our churches have, San Francisco has that beautiful conch shell that they use for baptisms. It's this huge shell that Robert Frost, I believe, was baptized in. So yeah, it's often a very prominent element within a church. Did you have one at the Garden Church?
Do not at the Garden Chapel. We do not,
Oh.
and I'm surprised to hear about
Mm.
your church and Wayfarers Chapel.
Mhm.
I'm curious if, since Barb is on, if Laporte has one, and I'm curious if uh, our church in Wilmington or some of the other older churches may have one because it was probably more part of our church services than it is these days. But um, I'm just curious about that too. And since you do have a baptismal font, do you have a baptism brochure or something that you give to parents when they have their babies baptized or when you have adults baptized?
I print out a little certificate similar to what you had that I give people, but I don't have a brochure.
Hmm.
I believe actually many moons ago, Kim Henricks, Kim Morrow published one. I believe they have copies at the San Francisco church. But yes, and a little brochure about what baptism is and what it means. It is an opportunity. It's one thing I'm always in conversation with people about. And I think when I was in Wilmington, actually, we put together something like this. Like when you baptize your child, you get a little kid's Bible and a little like, you know, we're now your church home. That's what we're trying to say. And I think um and so, whether you come back every week or you come back when your children are getting married or when there's a death in the family, that there's a kind of intention that relationship is now here. Um, Karen Conger is online and she's offering a comment. She says, infant baptism, as you've described so well, Sage, is very important and can be very beautiful. I was baptized as an infant in the DC church. I don't remember it, obviously, but I'm thankful. And maybe we need another ceremony, though confirmation fills this to some extent.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think there's something about remembering your baptism. I'll be preaching on this on Sunday, and I'm thinking about one of the things they do in the Episcopal Church is they'll have like a remember your baptism. If there is a baptism, they always encourage everybody to remember their baptism, and they'll take a giant like tree bough and dip it in the baptismal font and fling it at people. So everybody gets sort of sprinkled with the water. Um, so that because that's what then brings it alive for us. Like as a baby, we don't remember it. Maybe the parents remember it, but then I think it's like if we're going to practice baptism, it's important probably for us to keep remembering it, because it is this ongoing process of regeneration. So yeah, I may fling water at my congregation this week to help them.
I've never heard of
Karen
that.
mentions the Methodist Church does that too. Yeah. Well, and in the Catholic Church, usually the baptismal font is kind of at the back, and you can dip your hand in it as you're leaving. Um, I think there's a lot of power in ritual, in not just words, but actually touching water, feeling water, and we're trying to have like this conversation about baptism and talk about its meaning, but kind of the whole point of it is it's not something you talk about, it's something you do. It's something you experience. And I like to often when I do a baptism or when I do these, it's like think about it when you're taking a shower, like remember whenever you are in water, to honor the kind of holy gift of that water and that cleansing. And um, sometimes I think because so much of the spiritual path is making it real, not just having it be this intellectual process, that being in the water can be meaningful. And I was thinking about your fundamentalist days and your immersion baptism. I sometimes I kind of wish we still did that, because I do think there's something about, and this is something Swedenborg speaks about in here, is that one of the symbols of baptism is not just getting clean, but it's dying and being reborn. And when you're under the water and you cannot breathe and it's dark, there's a symbolism of that death to our lower self that baptism is meant to symbolize, the darkness kind of before the light. And then you come out of the water and then there's light and you're breathing again. And you don't quite get that symbolism when you just dribble some water onto a little baby's head. Um, but I think it's an important part of it. One of the sentences in here, 205, since everyone who is being regenerated also undergoes crises of the spirit, which are spiritual battles against evil and falsity, the waters of baptism also mean spiritual crises. Um, you know, this is about being reborn. It's not just about being made nice or made clean. It really is I think it is a ritual, a sacrament that's meant to help us feel the depth of that, and I think the fundamentalists and the kind of that they kind of convey that a little more. I don't like the conclusions they draw from it that
Yeah.
they that we are these horrible sinful creatures that must, perfect ourselves. But I do like the kind of the way it acknowledges that necessary death that precedes new life. We have another person joining us online. Ralph Kern says that immersion baptism does happen in our church. He remembers Horan Gutfeld doing a baptism at Split Mountain Camp in the Kern River. And he sent someone a photo of that recently. I've heard too, Ralph, of others doing baptisms, immersion baptisms when we're near bodies of water. We've never, I don't think any of our churches have ever had like the full pool font. But our church is full of so much diversity. I think people have done all kinds of different things to symbolize to celebrate the sacrament. There's no rules about whether you want to dunk yourself or get a little dribble. He says this was in 72 or 73, so it was a while ago. I feel like there have been some baptisms at Almont in the we call it Brandau Bay, the little swimming hole at Almont New Church Assembly. I imagine there have been baptisms there over the years. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if anyone online recalls if we have anything in if the Swedenborgian Church of North America has anything in the website that is a downloadable brochure or anything on baptismal publications. It might be something for the Standing Committee on Educational Resources to provide, but I'd have to go through our church history to see if we had any brochures. I think we did at one time.
Yeah.
We don't have any publications like the one I showed you where there's an agreement with the parents and a little bit of instruction on what the consecration of baptism means.
Yeah.
And
I'd encourage you to reach out to the central office because they probably have a copy of the brochure I'm mentioning that Kim wrote. They also used to publish the baptism service, so you would just have to fill in the names. I'm pretty sure they've stopped publishing those, but it's possible those electronic files may still be available. And Barb's mentioning that yes, there have been baptisms in Brandau Bay at Almont. Which I'm sure there have. Yeah. What more to say about baptism? I wonder about, I mean, it is in the Swedenborgian Church and in relationship to how Swedenborg describes the sacraments, the two sacraments are baptism and the Holy Supper. So this week we're talking about baptism, and next week we'll be talking about the Holy Supper. So those are the two kind of central, those are the things, those are the requirements, those are the two ritual acts that we are charged to participate in, and to lead and to hold as a community. And well, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how much I have to say about it. I think they're profound and powerful. They can be profound and powerful, and they can hold not much meaning. And I guess that's just sort of true for everything, right? It depends on what we bring to the experience. And Karen's mentioning that Jim Lawrence perhaps would know about those brochures. That'd be another person to reach out to.
Sure. I think regarding your comment, the meaning of these sacraments, particularly baptism, that it's a requirement of our faith to make it meaningful. It's like the woman who touched the hem of Jesus' garment. It's his comment that no, it's your faith that has made you well. I think in any kind of ritual for our denomination or any church for that matter, the meaning that it holds to a great extent is the meaning that your faith provides it.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's consecrating a child for Christian upbringing or an adult deciding that they will renounce all of the evils that they've been involved with and commit their lives, dedicate themselves to following the commands of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all regarding the faith that we bring to it. And basically that's what he's saying in 207 in this chapter anyway.
Mm-hmm.
People who've been baptized should be aware that baptism itself does not give them either faith or salvation, but it does bear witness that they will receive faith and be saved if they are regenerated.
Yeah.
And I like that expression, receive faith, because I'm reminded of that verse in John chapter 9 where the believer said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.
Mm-hmm.
We are given faith,
Mm-hmm.
Lord, but we are also given the freedom to choose whether to pursue that faith
Yeah.
and get more faith. Which brings me to my next question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Since you mentioned regeneration, and regeneration, as we know in our theology, is an ongoing process. Baptism, of course, is just a one-time thing, as an adult anyway. So when we're baptized, it's symbolic, but it works hand in hand with this concept of we're born again, and now the process of regeneration can begin.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, regeneration's been going on as long as we've been adults and have chosen to follow Jesus. Would you care to comment on the difference between regeneration and baptism?
I was struck with the comment you made, Paul, about by having baptism, by having a sacrament, a ritual act that we can choose to do. We're signifying our assent, our participation. And I have come to really believe that's important, that everything is spiritual all the time and God is always with us, but we can not acknowledge that. Like we can choose not to acknowledge that. And that regeneration really takes off because of our willingness to participate. So I think in my mind, that's why the rituals of the church are useful, because they point out like, no, it's not just all fine and we'll just all sit around and we'll just all be holy. Like there's an intention that's required and a commitment. And so I think baptism can signify the parents making that commitment. Just by having it be a ritual, it kind of reminds us, oh, that's something I'm choosing. But I think what it kind of does is it's like in the back of our mind, oh, there's this thing, oh, I was baptized. Oh, what does that mean? Oh, it was this choice. But then it's like, I think when regeneration really starts, like when we actually are beginning to be reborn, that that maybe the baptism sort of sets the stage for that to occur. It gives us a framework for what's happening now. I mean, I doubt that there's very many instances of like the very same minute that we're baptized, our spiritual lives line up with our physical lives and what we're doing. And all of a sudden, I haven't heard a lot of experiences of people having their, like Jesus did, having their baptism and immediately, you know, being changed. But it's like an echo. Or it's like, it's our best effort. We're trying to be faithful, and we've received and then fostered and created these rituals to symbolize the process that is only internal, that we aren't in control of, but that we can um but that we can maybe foster through our willingness or through our assent. I don't know if that makes sense, but
It does.
there's a part of me that has wanted to say it's not important. And I will be very honest with you about that, because my church is a bar now. I don't have any connection to that community. I don't remember that. It wasn't meaningful to my parent, like what was the point? Well, was there any point? There's a big part of me that feels like, and I see the disconnection that so many humans have with the church. Another formative story for me is that my grandparents were Catholic and Methodist. And when they decided to get married, both of them left the church entirely, because my grandfather was told he would rot in hell if he married my grandmother. So I have a lot of religious trauma about ritual and rightness, and I hate thinking that any of that ever gets in the way of someone's relationship to God. Oh, I can't marry that person because I wasn't baptized. I mean, it becomes very legalistic that I have to have this so that I can have that. I All of that just turns my stomach and makes me want to kind of throw it all in the trash. But kind of when I can step away from that reactivity and just see we've all been doing our best, and that there are some divine sparks, that have sort of been sprinkled through these traditions and through these rituals that, as we've talked about, can hold deep meaning and love, or they can become legalistic and separating. And it's our job and our faith to make them beautiful if we want to do. And I think, as I've sort of softened in my reactivity to some of the kind of the ritualistic nature of church, I'm like, as long as we don't say this is what makes you holy, as long
Mm.
as we don't say, okay, yeah, you are good when holy if you've been baptized and if you have the right this and the right that, like that's when we are going down a bad path. But if we're on the other side of like, God is amazing and mysterious and we're all beautiful and holy, and here's some rituals and traditions that we've developed, and like we can see it more as play and joy and continuity and tradition, and it's not causing God to work. We're not controlling God through our ritual acts, but we're honoring the process that we're in, and we're participating in. But I'd rather go to a baptism than a football game. Like there's something, it's sacred, it's holy, it's because we choose to make it such, and because we yeah, because of the faith, because of God, not because this external activity um is the answer. And I think that's a real tension that we're called to hold in the new church in particular, because a lot of what Swedenborg says kind of makes you think maybe we don't need these rituals. It's not about them.
Mhm.
And I think that's it. We don't need them, but like what else are we going to do while we're alive? Like we don't need them, but we can glory in them. We can be joyful in them. We can, and what other rituals might we want to create to glory in the, beauty of God? And um
Yeah, let me add this to what you're saying because I think there's another element that you haven't mentioned.
uh-huh.
and that is the proclamation part. If you stop and think about the fact that the institution of marriage, for example, and I'm not trying to compare marriage to baptism, I'm just saying that the institution of marriage is honored still in many societies, and ours included. But there are many people who choose not to be married, but live together and basically live a married life. What marriage does is the institution of marriage and the act of being married is a public proclamation.
Mhm.
And in one sense, baptism is a public proclamation.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about this morning, the fact that many churches, we are a small church with a very big message on unity and freedom of choice. But not to be legalistic, but if we don't put that into action, in other words, we can talk about unity, we can talk about how we stand against things that are discriminatory, how we stand for the things that we truly believe in, and the things that our convictions tell us we must stand up and say this is the right thing to do. But we don't do much in the world of, I'm going to speak on my own part. Our church, we don't do a whole lot of activism. Um, so when we say that, for example, that we're against discrimination, we're not running any programs to proclaim that. And this is not a criticism of anybody else. It's just my being aware that there is an aspect of baptism and an aspect of our rituals. Think about the fact that the Lord's Supper is a ritual that Jesus basically began, even though it's a modernization of the Passover. But some churches actually have a ritual washing of the feet. We don't. But I mean, it's another ritual that Jesus essentially started. So I'm just saying that the rituals themselves will only carry the meaning, as you pointed out, that we bring to it in our faith, in our desire to follow God. But there's also a public proclamation part of it, which we're making very public. This is our desire. This is our choice. And this is what we're doing to symbolize how important the Lord's commands are to each and every one of us.
Mhm. I like that. Yeah. A couple more comments online. Barb was asking if we baptize because Jesus was baptized, and it's certainly a part of it. Here's the Son of God being baptized, and some would say, why do you need to be, so it's a signification of the beginning of the spiritual path. And of course, he was baptized before his public ministry began. So it's just another way that this is a sacrament, a ritual that's been around for eons, many, many, many centuries, long before Jesus came to be. And I wanted to make a point to what you were sharing, Paul, that I've been thinking about a lot is I think public worship and church and Sunday morning at 11 and wedding ceremonies and baptisms, they just as you said, they're public proclamations of our commitment to the spiritual life. And I think there's incredible use in that. Like if we need to get together as a community and be reminded of that. That's important. And what Swedenborg is really motivated by in his writing is that those proclamations are only as important as all of the middle parts of our lives are changed. And I just think that's really been thinking about that a lot. And I think there's sort of some criticism, and I hear this in the world right now that we're kind of only interested in the public proclamations. Like we're only interested in the wedding, but we're not really concerned about how the marriage is going, or we're only interested in the baptism, but then we're not, I think we can err on the side of prioritizing those public proclamation moments. And so that's another challenge and tension we need to hold in the new church is like, yeah, let's get together and worship. Let's have spaces like the Garden Chapel that are dedicated to the Lord intentionally and verbally expressed, and that everything's holy ground. We're always and that the real purpose of these proclamations is not to talk a good game, but to be changed, to be transformed, to be made new. So there always has to be a way in which these sacraments are we're not idolizing them as, oh, now we've done our due. And I think, and that's what Swedenborg's really railing against the church as like, well, as long as you show up at this time and you do these things, then you're going to be okay. You're going to be saved. And that is not how it works. That's not what it's about. It's about wanting to participate in this holy life that of every minute, and letting these rituals and these sacred spaces and these traditions support that. And I think we really we need to always reflect on how are our traditions, how are our sacred spaces, how are they supporting growth, connection, love, community, and how might they be getting in the way? And I don't think we can argue that they don't sometimes get in the way. I think we have a lot of examples of how they have gotten in the way at Swedenborg's time and still today. Karen is asking, I believe baptism is the only time in Swedenborgian liturgy where the entire Trinity is evoked, because the Lord specifically directs that be done. Yes, I think that's probably true, Karen. You know, baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit that's the official way to baptize. That's every church, I think because we see ourselves as you know, people want to be baptized and they want that baptism to stick. So we baptize the way everyone baptized. So when you're 25 and you want to get married, you can say, okay, yes, I was baptized at the Swedenborg Chapel and it counts. I can marry this Catholic woman or whatever the next thing is. Yes, we baptize in that same form. And we have another question now. This is from Jamie. She's a neophyte and sometime lurker in these discussions. And this is a question for Paul. I think you earlier characterized the process of regeneration as starting with our decision to follow Jesus. That sounded new to me, and I feel like I've missed something big in terms of it starting with following Jesus. Could you point out where that's explicit in Swedenborg's writings? Want to talk about what you mean by following Jesus?
Sure, yeah. No, I can't point that out in Swedenborg's writings, but I can tell you this, that the decision, I made the decision to follow Jesus on April 9th of 1972. The baptism that I showed everybody this morning was from September 23rd, 1956. So there's obviously a difference, but that was a baptism that my parents initiated, not me. I didn't get baptized until long after that decision in April of 1972. So, but I think again, it was a public proclamation of a choice I had made. Just like when we get married, the ceremony itself happens long after we fall in love and decide that we're going to be married. So. But my comment was simply that it was a public proclamation that I have determined to live the rest of my life following Jesus. And as Sage so aptly pointed out, that any decision that we make, it has to be followed up. It has to be consistent with our behavior. And I'll add this too, Sage. You mentioned Kim Morrow. She was the first one that actually made me realize that the word evangelize has the word angel in it. And in our theology, our evangelizing is basically becoming more like angels, as living, in other words, actually putting into our daily practice the behaviors that we associate with angels and with heaven. That is, of loving, of wanting to see others blessed, of trying to be a blessing to others, as well as a reflection of God's light.
That's well put. And in continued response to Jamie, I think that Swedenborg probably doesn't use the phrase choosing to follow Jesus, but you know, he's Christian and through, and the the call of the new church is the call to, as you're aptly describing in being an angel, is to love each other. That's the simplest basic. That's really all we have to do. We sometimes make it complicated, but the call to love one another, to love God, to feel ourselves as a part of this larger life, where we're not motivated primarily by our selfish need to take care of me, but our hearts are open in relationship to others. And that Jesus, that's what Jesus did. That was what Jesus showed us God was this open-hearted freedom that we're called to live into. So I would say many Swedenborgians understand themselves to be following Jesus, like just like you, Paul, in terms of following that example of living that kind of open-hearted, brave life where our motivation is not to protect ourselves, not to set ourselves apart from one another, but to speak the truth with love and to serve others. I mean, it's it's another place where sometimes throughout history, following Jesus has sort of maybe been equated with an identity that I follow. I'm a follower of Jesus. So now, but it's actually about a way of life that's much bigger than any identity. It actually busts through identities because that was his whole thing. Sinners, prostitutes, come to me. It wasn't about bringing and loving those who had the right identity, but loving everyone as children of God. So, good questions. And Karen's recommending that Potts Concordance is available online. It might be fun to look up regeneration and find some references. Yeah. Any final thoughts on baptism? We've got just a few more minutes.
Well, Karen brought up the point on the Trinity. I think it's interesting that in our church, every time we sing the offertory song, praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, that's mentioned every Sunday in our church.
Yeah. Yeah, we still have a lot of the traditional language. I think our denomination, we're Christian, but we're founded after Swedenborg's writing. We're kind of trying to be called to be a new church, and we have a legacy. It was primarily Methodists and Anglicans that started this adventure called the General Convention of the New Jerusalem back in the late 1700s. And so a lot of the liturgy, that's why I'm very at home in the Episcopal Church, because a lot of the liturgy is very much the same. We haven't some communities have gotten really creative and liberal and kind of created some new ways of framing all of this. And I've certainly seen some very beautiful kind of new models of how baptism can look. And a lot of our sacraments really do look very similar to any other Christian church that you would go to. And Barb is mentioning, we certainly have a different understanding of the Trinity than some churches. In the actual sacrament, we say the same words, but we perhaps understand them slightly differently in them being three aspects of one God versus three separate entities. Although this is one of the things about the new church is I think a lot of people see and wonder about is over the last 300 years, that's not as the Trinity was kind of controversial a while. And now over time, we're not really fighting about the Trinity in the same way that we once did. And I think a lot more Christians do see the oneness of the Trinity, do not kind of fight about, oh, these are three separate persons. And a lot of the ideas that Swedenborg presented that are so central to our church have actually started to live in a lot of different communities, that angels are people that used to live on earth, that God is one and the Trinity is these three separate entities. So it's sort of another sign that this new church is descending, not only just in our Swedenborgian circles, but in kind of human populations at large. Yeah. Well, we found some things to say, Paul. I think we did okay.
Yeah, thank you.
It was a shorter chapter this week, but it was good. And so next week we'll be moving on to the Holy Supper. I'm actually going to be having a new guest next week. I've actually invited my husband. Speaking of the Episcopalians, I've invited him to join us because the sacrament of communion is very important to him in his spiritual life. So I thought it'd be interesting to have him join the conversation. So Reverend Dr. Ted Cole will be here next week. And I hope many of you will join us as well, and we'll continue on our way. Thanks so much, Paul, for your time.
Thank you.
All right.
Pleasure,
Bye, everybody.